I spent 6 months trying to become invisible. Every morning, I timed my coffee breaks, memorized elevator schedules, and avoided the executive floor like it was cursed. Because at the top of that building, behind glass walls and polished oak doors, sat the one person who could end my career with a single sentence. Our CEO. The woman everyone admired. The woman I had accidentally embarrassed in front of the entire board. And then, on the one night I finally agreed to go on a blind date, she walked into the restaurant and sat down across from me. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that even the most impossible situations can turn into something beautiful, take a moment to like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that life can surprise us when we least expect it. Her name was Evelyn Hart. She wasn't just any CEO. She was the youngest chief executive in our company's history, the force behind its explosive growth, and the reason our startup had become a multinational success in less than 5 years. She had a reputation for precision, discipline, and emotional distance. People didn't just respect her, they feared her. And I had given her a reason to. 6 months earlier, I had been a nervous project manager presenting a product prototype to the board. It was my first major pitch. I had stayed up for nights perfecting every slide. But when the moment came, the system glitched. The demo froze. Investors shifted in their seats. I panicked. And in my panic, I said something careless. I implied that leadership had rushed the timeline. The room went silent. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. She stepped in, saved the presentation with calm authority, and redirected the conversation. The meeting ended with polite applause, but I knew I had crossed a line. I wasn't fired. That was worse. Instead, I was reassigned to back-end operations, important but invisible. No more presentations. No more direct access to executive meetings. Just quiet spreadsheets and silent hallways. And Evelyn never once acknowledged me again. So when my sister insisted I needed to get a life, and signed me up for a blind date, I resisted. I didn't have the energy for small talk or forced smiles. But she said the woman was kind, intelligent, and way out of my league, which, apparently, was supposed to be encouraging. The restaurant was warm and softly lit, tucked between old brick buildings downtown. I arrived early, rehearsing polite conversation in my head. When the door opened and she stepped inside, my heart didn't just skip a beat, it stopped. Evelyn Hart stood at the entrance, scanning the room. She wasn't in her usual sharp suit. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair loose over her shoulders. For a split second, she looked almost uncertain. Human. Her eyes found mine. Recognition flickered. And then she walked toward my table. The universe has a cruel sense of humor. She sat down gracefully, placing her clutch on the table. There was no assistant, no board members, no intimidating aura of corporate dominance. Just the two of us, face to face, outside the glass walls of the office. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she let out a quiet breath and said that this was unexpected. Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't commanding. It was tired. I apologized immediately, not for the date, but for the presentation months ago. The words spilled out of me, clumsy and overdue. I told her I never meant to undermine her authority. That I had been overwhelmed and scared. She listened without interrupting, and then she surprised me. She said she never reassigned me out of anger. She said she moved me because she saw potential, but also fragility. She believed I needed space to rebuild confidence without the pressure of high-stakes visibility. She thought it would protect me. Protect me. That wasn't the story I had told myself for 6 months. The tension between us shifted. Not vanished, but softened. Dinner unfolded cautiously at first. We spoke about neutral things, books, travel, childhood memories. I learned she grew up in a small town, raised by a single father after losing her mother at 12. I learned that success had been less about ambition and more about survival. She built walls because the world had taken too much from her too early. For the first time, I didn't see a CEO. I saw a woman who had carried responsibility like armor for years. And maybe she saw something different in me too. Because she started asking about my reassignment, not as a superior evaluating performance but as someone genuinely curious. I admitted that I felt small. That being moved had reinforced my worst fears about not being good enough. That I had been avoiding her not out of resentment, but shame. She looked at me with something that wasn't pity. It was understanding. That night didn't end with fireworks or grand confessions. It ended with a quiet walk outside the restaurant. The city lights reflected in puddles from an earlier rain. The air felt lighter. She said she was glad she came. So was I. But reality returned the next morning. The office was still the office. She was still my CEO. And rumors travel fast. By midday, half the building seemed aware that we had been seen leaving the same restaurant. Whispers followed me down hallways. Colleagues who had barely acknowledged me in months suddenly looked curious. Suspicious. Power dynamics are complicated. I knew any personal connection could be misinterpreted. Worse, it could damage her credibility. I had no desire to be that employee who leveraged a date for career gain. So I kept my distance again. Weeks passed. We didn't speak outside of necessary emails. At meetings, her demeanor remained professional. If anyone suspected something, there was no evidence. But beneath the surface, something had changed. She began inviting me back into strategic discussions, not publicly, but through detailed feedback requests. She challenged my ideas, pushed me, expected more. It wasn't favoritism. It was belief. One evening, long after most employees had left, I found myself in the office kitchen making coffee. I hadn't noticed her standing there until she spoke. She said she had been thinking about that night. So had I. She admitted that leading the company had become isolating. That every interaction was filtered through authority. That sitting across from someone who spoke to her as a person, not a title, had unsettled her in ways she didn't expect. I told her that fear had shaped my perception of her. That I had built a version of her in my head that wasn't entirely fair. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was honest. Over the next few months, something delicate formed. We didn't rush. We didn't label. We simply allowed conversations to grow, about vulnerability, about failure, about the cost of ambition. But challenges remained. When a major investor questioned our restructuring plan, tension rippled through the company. The board was divided. Pressure mounted. And once again, I found myself presenting analysis, this time at her direct request. Standing in that boardroom, memories of my past failure echoed loudly. My hands trembled. But when I looked at her, she didn't intervene. She nodded once. It wasn't authority. It was trust. I delivered the presentation calmly. Clearly. Confidently. And when it ended, the approval was unanimous. That wasn't the moment I fell for her. It was the moment I forgave myself. If this story is touching your heart, if you've ever felt misunderstood, underestimated, or afraid of second chances, take a second right now to like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe. And before we reach the end, I have a special request. Please comment the word courage if you believe growth begins where fear ends. The turning point didn't come from success. It came from scandal. An anonymous email accused Evelyn of favoritism. Suggested inappropriate closeness. Claimed I was being groomed for promotion. The board demanded clarification. She called me into her office, not as a date, not as a friend, but as a leader facing potential fallout. She said she would step back from direct supervision over my department to avoid conflict of interest. She said protecting the company came first. There was pain in her eyes. Not because of the rumor, but because of what it implied. That genuine connection must always be suspect. That power corrupts even simple human moments. I told her I would request a transfer to another division. That I didn't want to jeopardize her leadership. For a second, the walls returned. Then she did something unexpected. She asked me, not as CEO, but as Evelyn, whether I was walking away out of fear again. The question hit deeper than any board critique. Was I, or was I finally strong enough to stand beside her without hiding? The investigation concluded weeks later. There was no evidence of misconduct. No preferential treatment. In fact, the audit praised her professionalism. But something had shifted publicly. She addressed the company at a town hall meeting. Spoke about transparency, about boundaries, about the complexity of balancing humanity with leadership. And then, in front of everyone, she acknowledged that leaders are allowed to have personal lives. That vulnerability is not weakness. That connection does not diminish competence. She didn't mention my name. She didn't have to. Months later, I moved into a new strategic role, earned, documented, indisputable. Not because I dated a CEO, but because I grew. And so did she. We took things slowly, carefully, respectfully. There was no dramatic resignation. No scandalous headlines. Just two people learning how to exist in both strength and softness. The night she officially asked me out, not as a blind date accident, but intentionally, we returned to the same restaurant. The same table, the same soft lighting, but this time, there was no fear. Only possibility. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that misunderstandings can transform into understanding, that fear can become courage, and that sometimes the person you're trying hardest to avoid might be the one who helps you grow, please engage with this video. Like it, share it, comment your thoughts. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Life doesn't always follow neat scripts. Sometimes you try to avoid your CEO. And sometimes she walks in as your blind date, and changes everything. And in the end, I realized something simple but powerful. I wasn't trying to avoid her. I was trying to avoid the parts of myself I was afraid to confront. She didn't just walk into that restaurant. She walked into the version of me I was becoming. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped running.